Hi everyone, thank you for coming down to today's event. I'm Cheng from SGInnovate, and we are very happy to collaborate with Radicali to bring you this amazing event. So at SGInnovate, we believe Singapore has the capabilities and resources to tackle hard problems from around the world. And part of our efforts includes knowledge sharing sessions like the one you're here for today. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this panel, so if you have any questions, do keep them in mind, and we will come around with a mic for you to ask our panel. So without further ado, I hand over the mic to Belinda, who's our moderator for the day. Belinda, please.
Thanks so much, Singh. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. Really appreciate you making the time. I'm sure that this is a topic that's very close to your heart, as it is for ours. So for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Belinda Cheng. I look after the Foundry, which is a startup incubator that's located in Sydney and Singapore, and hence why I'm wearing this T-shirt. We're mainly focused on looking after B2B startups and helping them grow and scale, so feel free to chat to me afterwards. But you're not here to listen to me. You're actually here to listen to these my highly esteemed colleagues that are sitting to the left of me. I think when we think of startups and we think of corporates, you know, we see and we envisage, I guess, a David and Goliath struggle. I think a lot of us probably in this room agree that they, you know, in terms of collaborations and opportunities work, they, you know, I think we all agree that we do need to find a way of being able to make this happen. And I think what we're going to do over the next 45 minutes or so is really try and explore how this does look like. What are some of the best practices that are out there? And look, we want to make this a really interactive and conversational panel. So before we get started, I might just do a quick straw poll of the audience. Can I ask how many of you are actually in the corporate space? Who of you are actually Goliaths? Okay, so we've got about maybe six or so of you. What about those of you that are in the startup ecosystem or are founders, work in startup teams? Okay, so maybe about 6, 7. Anyone that's in the sort of the ecosystem, so potentially in accelerators, incubators, university labs, nothing there. What about potential investors? Anyone that's in that investment space? So there are obviously a few people that didn't put their hand up. I'm curious to see what side of the fence you're in. Are you interested bystanders, or could someone shout out where they're from? Oh, you guys are a tough crowd. 4:30. I need to get the booze flowing to get these people moving. Anyway, it looks like, so if I look at the show of hands of people that did put their hands up, it looks like we've got a bit of a 50-50 split between startup and corporates. Now, before we get underway, I really want to make sure that you guys get something out of this. So I'm actually going to hand the mic back to you guys very briefly. Does anyone have a really burning question that they'd like to ask the panel? Or any points they'd like to address? Nothing at all. Tough crowd, guys. I think they are. Is there something, if there isn't, look, we'll allocate some time to the end. As Singh mentioned, we'll make sure that there's probably a good 15, 20 minutes at the end for you to warm up and to also then ask some questions. So, you know, keep your thinking hats on. I'm now going to turn to my left, and I'd like to see if I could get my fellow panellists to introduce themselves. So I might start with you, Priyanka. Feel free to... Yeah, that should be on.
Okay, so my name is Priyanka Mukherjee. I'm here from Tata Communications, which is a B2B telecoms digital infrastructure provider headquartered out of India, but also having a fairly global presence across the world. I'm based here in Singapore. I'm part of the Corporate Venturing and Innovation Group. And essentially, there are two things that the team looks at. What we call internal innovation, which is about incubating startups internally. So I essentially run an internal incubator. And then we also have the external venturing part that we talk about, which is about working with startups and kind of collaborating and partnering. So yeah, that's me. Over to you, Ravi.
Great. Hi, my name is Ravi Patel. I run Grab Financial's prepaid MasterCard business. I guess what I do for Grab is sort of, I'm an entrepreneur within a larger organization. So to give you some context, Grab Financial started off about 2 years ago as an independent business with about 20 people. Now we have about 1,250 in over 2 years, in just about 2 years. Prior to that, I spent about 5 or 6 years as an entrepreneur. I sort of launched 3 companies, one in payments, one in microfinance in Indonesia and Malaysia, and then also a micro savings business in Singapore. And before that, I spent about 15 years working for banks, looking at corporate development and strategy. This is when sort of the European and American banks were growing globally before they decided to stop. And now we're in the age of Asian growth, so things are quite different right now. So yeah, so I probably sit on both sides of the David and Goliath, and right now I'm probably in the middle. That's right, I'm literally in the middle. And then
Hi guys, my name is Hardesh. I'm going to keep it really short. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Radicali. We're a startup focused on, we're in the RegTech space, so regulatory technology, and we help compliance teams in financial services basically track, act, and understand regulations much faster and easier than they used to. We're backed by SGInnovate, Entrepreneur First and C+, and yeah, let's just get into it, right?
Do it, absolutely. So maybe whilst you've got the mic, Hardesh, so why, I mean, you've been on both sides of the fence. So you've been David, you've been Goliath, you're now currently the David of the world at the moment. Why do you want to work with corporates, when you're thinking about it from Radicali's perspective?
Well, it's a simple answer, right? We exist to serve corporates, essentially, because we are in the B2B space. We're here to solve problems for compliance teams who are in, corporates. So our entire existence is informed by their, by their presence, essentially. That's why. So literally, we depend on them. Our entire business is for them, and we depend on them. So that's why we have to work with them, not because we want to.
So I think, so I guess from a corporate's perspective, I mean, I'm here on Team Goliath's side. I know for me, we actually met Hardesh through a bit of a program, seeing if we could actually find an opportunity for EY and Radicali to work with. And I think the opportunity for us was the promise of the agility, the technology that we couldn't actually do very well ourselves. But the one thing that I'm actually curious to get your thoughts on is, how do you actually prove your legitimacy when you're dealing with corporates? Because we know, let's face it, startups do fail, right? And when you're dealing with corporates that are traditionally risk-averse, conservative, and having spent a bit of time here in Asia, there is certainly probably a little bit more risk that I'm having to deal with potentially when I compare it to other markets. Really keen to get your thoughts on that.
It's hard. Some corporates are more open than others. They're much more receptive to startups reaching out to them for multiple purposes, even just having a coffee and just trying to figure out, look, what are your biggest problems, right? Trying to identify and articulate their problem areas, the potential use cases that would be useful for a startup. And you start from there and you go down to having conversations about running a POC, running a pilot, and then progressing from that. So it's starting small with very small ambitions. But some companies are much more open to doing so. Others will just flat out say no to you for a variety of reasons, and sometimes you don't even know why they say no to you. But what we did, we spent 2 months reaching out to everyone that we could in the early stages. Some were very receptive. Some just didn't even respond to any of our requests, right? But that's the nature of the game, right? So yeah.
And Ravi, being on both sides of the fence, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I guess when we started this discussion, I think what's unique about startups is the stage of the business cycle that they're in. So it's not about the size. You can have very mature companies that are very small. But startups are the infancy of their concept. So I think, when the stage that Hardesh has been at for the last, 2 years now? 1 year. You're still sort of working out what is that problem, and sort of, I think the advantage of the startup in this context, the fact that since you're still learning what your business is, you can customize to the problems that larger organizations face. So large companies are great clients because they have huge budgets and they have huge problems. And I guess where startups in particular can be useful is in sort of solving very specific things. And I guess in particular, I think startups are great because they can leverage innovation in terms of new technologies and new processes that existing companies would find hard to do themselves. So for example, if I'm the CEO of a bank, for me to basically restructure or reorganize things be very difficult. However, to work with you and say, well, why don't you do this? We can structure it, we can ring fence it, we can de-risk it. Yeah. I can then drive a lot of progress in this arrangement where I wouldn't then take any direct risk. So I think in those arrangements it works well. You then get your business, you then grow, and then in 6 months, 12 months, we reevaluate, and that's the nature. Things move very quickly.
So it's just almost like you're outsourcing your own innovation in a way, and you're experimenting and de-risking on that front. Priyanka, I'd like to bring you into the conversation as well. Thoughts or reactions to what's been said? I don't know if you're looking at this from Tata's perspective, from the Goliath perspective as well. And you're also in a unique situation when you actually do take investment in startups as well. So maybe there's I'd be really curious to see your thoughts on that.
So I think I would resonate some of the stuff that Hardesh was talking about, that every company, every corporate is different, right? Some are more open, some are more advanced in their thinking. So there's a bit of luck in that, and a lot of, no's and knocking on doors which don't lead anywhere. So I see that, and I completely agree with that. But I think one thing about what to think about to crack that formula or get a better outcome instead of 1 interview out of 100, getting to 10 interviews out of 100, is maybe trying to understand the corporate's imperatives. What are their problems, and why is it that they are interested in working with a startup? And then being able to tailor your pitch to that is very important. We talk to tens of startups. I think over the last 2-3 years that we've been formally working as a team, looking at external startups, we've probably looked at 1,800 startups, qualified deeply, maybe 500 of them, done 75 POCs. So we've seen, not as much as some of the incubators and VC funds maybe, but we've seen our fair share, right? And there's a lot of generic talk about this is my product and this is what it does. Not a lot of focus on this is what I understand your problem is, or this is the use case that I think I can help you solve. So having that sort of a more informed conversation when you initially reach out to corporate, I think would make that initial opening of the door easier.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So I guess having seen these many tens of startups that have come through your door, what's some advice? I mean, there are a couple of people here from startups that want to work with corporates. What are some tips that you can give them to help make them sexy, to help make it easier for a corporate to work with?
So I guess initially recognizing that it is a different beast, right? We do have our own challenges and our own limitations, right? Everybody knows enterprise sales cycles are long. It's not long because people want to be difficult and there's inertia. It's long because there are so many stakeholders to get together to get a decision, right? It's long because people are much more, or people as in the company, a corporate, is much more risk averse or is much more conscious of reputation and branding and the implications of a certain project or a certain partner not living up to that sort of expectation, right? So understanding and recognizing that, I think, helps in setting expectations. And I think it goes both ways. For corporates to recognize where a startup is coming from, to understand the urgency that they have, to understand the pressures that they're under, especially either they're raising funding or they've just raised funding and they have like really demanding investors on their board, demanding month-on-month growth and things like that, right? So understanding each other's needs and dynamics and establishing that working kind of a goal up front. This is what I want to get out of this partnership, and this is the time limit, that timeline that I'm working towards. And this is, frankly, I have told people that if you are in a stage where you're going to run out of money in 6 months, we are not the people you should be coming to, right? Being aware of the limitations that you are working with is important, and establishing that expectation up front for both parties, I think, is important.
No, definitely. I saw you just do a bit of a wry smile there, Ravi, when I think Priyanka was talking about the...
I guess what I was thinking is that, I think it's sensible to sort of break down corporates into probably 2 different brackets, just for simplicity. You've got sort of large technology companies that are sort of relatively new. So you take something like a Google, or to some degree even like a Grab. I mean, we've got like 5,000 people now. And as a corporate now, we work with quite a lot of startups. And then also, if you think about the traditional sort of corporates like banks, oil companies, logistics companies, as a startup, when you deal with, let's say Grab, for example, I can speak from firsthand, is that we are designed and configured in every respect, from our people, our culture, our systems, our APIs, to work with startups. So if we typically want to work with a startup, it's not difficult. Now, if I'm looking from a bank perspective, the whole genesis of the model, the evolution of it, there are many frictions in it because they're not used to this type of business. And I think they're not used to the risks, they're not used to the complexity. So you're asking a lot of change in order to kind of get things done. So I feel like, if you segment the 2 out there, the traditional industries, they really need to rethink about, does it even make sense to work with a startup? Because you're going to burn out early stage companies. Should you think about other ways to work with, other ways to drive innovation? And it could be having an intermediary layer like an innovation center, which is why that sort of exists, right? To facilitate the ease through the organization. And I'm sure you can talk for hours about the problems in that. With companies like Grab, I mean, I can basically have a meeting with someone and in 24 hours have an NDA signed, in 1 week have a contract signed. Took a bit longer, I think, with you. But and within sort of a month, actually be doing business. So I think the David and Goliath thing, I mean, the real Goliath, we have to sort of, Goliath A and Goliath B.
No, that's absolutely true. There's a different maturity level, I think, with some corporates and their experience. Hardesh, I guess I'm going to, given that you've actually sort of been on the positive side of having worked with Grab and Ravi, you've obviously working with other enterprises as well. What do you think corporates need to be aware of? What are the things that really drive you nuts that you think, hang on, corporates, sort your stuff out? I mean, maybe just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Boy, I mean, where do I get started? I think I can share like 2 stories, right? So working with Grab, we reached out to Grab really early on in our journey, when we would virtually just had a really, really ugly version of our solution. It was disgusting to me even. But the team at Grab was very receptive, like Ravi said. I think Grab is very, they've articulated their needs quite clearly internally. They're quite receptive to working with startups. So we reached out to them and, we made promises, like look, by a certain point in time, we'll have this feature ready, we'll be in this position. And I think to our credit, we delivered and we met those timelines. And I think we gained trust with our internal stakeholders from Grab incrementally, which is what I think eventually persuaded them to get in bed with us, essentially. Now, that's Grab. And having spoken to other corporates, I can give you one example. So I pitched to this corporate in May, and I think I had 2 meetings over a span of 3 days, and it was really, the meetings went really well. I had internal champions identified. That was in May. I'm still waiting for them to get back with an okay, because they've got internal committees that they need to get approvals from, and they're finding out about these new committees every week, right? That even my stakeholders didn't know about, right? So it's really difficult, and that's actually more the norm rather than an exception. So a lot of corporates are actually in the same boat, and I experienced it when I was in a corporate, when I wanted to create a solution for my team. And I was just telling the guys a story earlier that it took me months to just navigate internal red tape, procurement, clearing budget, clearing approvals from senior management, and it came to a point where I was like, you know what, screw it, we don't really need a solution anymore. So. So if you're a startup, right, that's pretty much what you're up against. You gotta pitch. You gotta find someone in a corporate to pitch to. That person has to be relevant, and that person then has to be bothered enough to go through all this hard work on your behalf and also on their own behalf. But it's a process. And so to circle back to your question, like what can corporates do better? Like honestly, I think we'll all touch on this point a little bit later. But it's about getting your culture right. From what I've seen, like digital transformation is this buzz, like these two buzzwords. Now everyone's talking about it, everyone wants to do it, but what does it actually really mean? And how well have you really articulated your strategy? Is there a strategy in place, or is this just reactive thinking because you're looking over your shoulders and your competitors are right, neck with you, right? So, and a lot of that comes back to culture, right? Who is driving this internally? Is it coming from the top, or is this more of a reactive thing? And that is basically the determinant, right, as to whether you're actually going to do something to facilitate that journey, whether it's internal or external, innovation, right? So that means streamlining your processes, maybe creating an express lane for startups, right? Having internal teams and individuals who are actively going out there to curate startups. So there are all these little things that can be done, but the fact that they're not being done is a reflection on how seriously the company is actually taking their journey, right?
I think something that Radicali does very well is that it's solving a sort of new problem. Because if I think about, like, and again, I'm sort of going to wear two hats. I'm going to wear my Grab hat and wear my banking hat. From a Grab perspective, like, we have a massive issue because we're growing so quickly that we don't have the resources, we don't have the team, we can't handle regulations. Well, I should be careful what I say there. But the things are moving so quickly that we're not resourced to handle all these things. So here comes a solution that comes along, and it's like, wow, this actually sort of ticks a lot of our boxes. And the access that you have through the channels that are now available in Singapore, platforms like SGInnovate, allow you actually sort of get access to the right people. You met our head of compliance, met our CEO very quickly. You had business sponsors like myself who sort of made this happen, and it moved quite quickly. Now, you go to a bank and you sort of present your solution. I can imagine a lot more challenges, i.e., well, we've got 15% of our workforce working compliance. What does that mean? Do we have to cut people out of the workforce? Redundancies are very difficult, and you have these challenges because I'm not telling you not to go for banks, but you're sort of trying to sell to people who find it very difficult to adapt to your environment. But there are these new fleet of companies, perhaps the future, if you will, who would need this. Yeah. So you're solving a new problem. Yeah. There's a little bit like, like if you think about Google's and Facebook's, they were sort of solving new problems that didn't exist 10 years ago, but because of internet, because of mobile phones, because of advertising industries, they became relevant. And I think that's where startups have a slight edge, is that you're able to solve tomorrow's problem, whereas no one else cares.
Absolutely, no, good point. I'm just going to do a pulse check with our audience. Any questions? Does anyone like to ask something right now?
Is everyone still awake?
Everyone's still, mate, tough crowd. All right, I'm going to check in with you in another 5 or 10 minutes, so just keep that brain percolating, because I'm going to hand over the mic. You're not allowed to leave until you ask a question. So Priyanka, I think we probably see this as well in terms of, I think touching on Hardesh's point around the culture piece. Are we doing this out of sort of reaction or fear? Are we doing this actually as part of a strategic kind of imperative? And I think one of the things that I've also noticed is, fair enough, getting CEO sponsorship is absolutely critical. You need to have that C-suite buy-in. But it's also the middle and internal management that you also need to bring along in the journey. Let's face it, a lot of business unit managers really don't know how to spell innovation or even know what a startup is, really. Have had very limited exposure to it. And I'm really curious to see how you've actually brought your organisation along that. Or, it sounds like your team was actually quite receptive to this anyway, but just wondering if you did have to iron out any kinks in the armoury there.
I'm going to drink my own Kool-Aid. I don't know about the rest of the company yet, but no, look, it's a challenge that every corporate, every organization is probably going through, right? We started on our innovation journey, and first of all, what does innovation mean, right? To define what innovation means for you as a company is very important. And there are many ways to do it, and there are many reasons to do it, but knowing why you're doing it is important. And it could be that I just want to raise my branding amongst the startup space, and that's fine too, but just recognize that, right? So anyways, we started our journey about 6 years ago when we started the internal innovation program that I currently run. And the entire premise there was to bring a change in the culture within the organization in terms of working like a startup, right? Allowing people the opportunity to create their own startup within the confines of a corporate. And the entire point was to be able to bring that startup mentality, agility that these guys are talking about into the corporate way of working. And then the second kind of objective was about trying to create new business opportunities for Tata Communications, obviously, right? And that was 6 years ago. And we've run that for a while. 3 years ago, we started our program around partnerships within the startup space. And 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, we formalized this group that I'm a part of because we realized that we needed dedicated people that Hardesh was talking about who would understand the startup world, who would understand the challenges of working in a corporate and try and work as a translator in between the two to facilitate things, right? So once that group was formed and given a very formal mandate, I think then it became easier to have those conversations with senior managers who are not part of the group right now to kind of champion the need and the concept of innovation, right? We understand that we have certain needs. These are your challenges. You have these gaps in your product roadmap. And you're not able to get to it, or you don't have the right talent, or you've tried and it's not working, right? Whichever of those reasons. Have you looked at something out there which is more agile, nimble, is able to move and solve problems in a more unencumbered way, right? So yeah, that's a big job of what we do, is to evangelize and to familiarize people with working with startups, and also then enabling the processes around it.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. One of the things that I'm actually curious about is really trying to measure impact and measuring success out of this from both sides of the equation. And Ravi, Grab epitomises this. You guys you've got this nailed, it seems like. So I'm just wondering, how does Grab measure success with these sorts of collaborations?
I don't think there's a metric that we set and we're tracking for that. It's difficult because of the stage, the type of business we are and the stage we're at. We're obviously growing very quickly, so we've got our sort of top-line business metrics. And I think at the more operational level, it's more experimental. So we're trying lots of different things out. And I think like something we talked about earlier on is the fact that some things are unique to sort of these new technology companies. This sort of ability to try different things out, ability to sort of experiment, ability to take risk, ability to fail. Some of the more traditional technology from the more traditional industries, it's difficult to take risks because these large organizations are very fragile. What I mean by that is if you sort of shake things up too much, everything from like data leakages, everything from like exposing malpractices 20, 30 years ago. So people don't want to take too much risk in sort of opening up too much. The younger companies, they can do it sort of relatively comfortable, and I think from that perspective, I feel like we can make mistakes, we can cover things up, we can get on with it, and that culture's imbibed in the company. So I think that's quite a huge thing for us. Like I said, having worked for banks, it's very difficult to get things done just because our risk team would sort of say no to a lot of things for good reasons. We don't, we have more deliver us 100x growth as opposed to worry about the risks.
No, absolutely. And I think for those of you that are in corporate innovation, it is tough to sometimes justify what success looks like. A lot of the time, it comes back down, I think, Hardesh, to culture, right? How curious and how willing corporates are willing to experiment and to reward that failure.
Actually, another point which I think we talked about was I was doing some consulting recently in Thailand, and Thai banks are really interesting because the Thai banking is quite domestic focused. None of the banks have really expanded too much regionally or internationally. They've all faced this challenge for access to developers and engineers. And as a result of that, what Thai banks have started doing is they've become much more open to working with small development studios, startups, and they're designed for this. So interestingly to me that, one of the leading digital banks in Asia is a pharma bank. K-Bank, Kasikorn Bank, and basically because they needed to grow, they built APIs, they started working with local startups, and now their whole culture from the CEO down is all around working with startups because they had to. I think that's an important thing. It's like, we talked about why do you innovate? Of course you can innovate because you feel like you need to, or, it's a cool thing to do. But when you need to do it for survival, that drives a shock down the spine of the company. People are able to sort of say, shit, if we don't do this, we're dead. Yeah. And that can then drive partnerships if need be, or working with startups or whatever, but just something else, right?
Yeah, I guess it all comes back down to that saying, necessity is the mother of all invention. You need that burning platform, and that sounds exactly what that Thai bank did. Hardesh, from a startup's perspective, how do you measure, impact and success with a relationship working with a corporate? I know you're still early days in your journey, but obviously when they don't respond, okay, that's a clear flat out rejection. But I'm curious if you've got some thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think it's an ongoing journey, right? So for us, you have to establish value before they get into bed with you. That's why they sign up with you eventually. It's because you're promising, you've demonstrated value. They're impressed enough, and if you've got enough credibility, then they'll sign up. They start paying you for your service. But it doesn't just end there, right? So it's not just about developing a fancy new product, right? It's also about service and consistent delivery. And preserving and maintaining that relationship with your customer, because you don't want to lose your customers, right? And for us, it's a lifeblood of our business. So I think, like Ravi said, there's no one particular metric that's going to be relevant here. I think for us, it's just really about that relationship, and we spend a lot of time reaching out to Grab and other people that we're working with, just to sort of reiterate the value and confirm that they're still deriving value from it, and what else, to sort of identify what else we can do for them, right? Because as cliched as it sounds, the way we try and run our business is that we're here to serve these specific individuals in these companies, right? So we have to be in tune what their needs are, not just today, but tomorrow as well. And that's how every business should function, right? You're serving a particular demographic. So whether you're a startup or a corporate, that's what you do, right? And you can't lose sight of that. So yeah, no one metric, but it's just great, a great product with great delivery, right? And great service.
Yep, makes sense. Priyanka, any thoughts that you might want to share?
So I guess linking back to why do you want to work with a startup, or what is your innovation agenda? Obviously, everybody wants to measure to see if you're making progress. Right? So depending on whatever that objective is, I guess the metrics or targets would be different. And honestly, I don't think we have it figured out. We're still trying to experiment with various things. But the one thing is also about building credibility for this program that we're running, right? The fact that you're trying to get a traditional company, as Ravi pointed out, to work with startups, to work with new emerging technology. I guess the one clear metric would be if say, for example, it's a if it's a startup that you are bringing on board because it enhances your particular product, right? So has that additional tech been able to impact the revenue line, right? Have they been able to help us respond to more RFPs, whatever it is, right? So then you can start thinking about metrics once you know why you are doing the work that you're doing with the startups, right? And then the second piece is around trying to measure impact or achievement to try to convince people that, look, this is a good program to be involved with, right? To create that buy-in, to create that culture change, right? So those are the two sets of metrics that I would think about. Specifics obviously could be different for every company. I think everybody cares about revenue, whether it's a corporate or a startup, so those are usually the good people where people start with, but then you have to go a layer deeper to understand why you're doing what you're doing, and then tracking to those reasons.
Yeah, I just got a little tangent there. I think no one really wants to work with a startup, right? I mean, it's a strange thing to say, isn't it? Because I mean, like, no, it's a strange thing to say, but I feel that what you're essentially doing by working with startups, you're crowdsourcing ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And therefore, the type of people who are able to be part of this crowdsourcing is a startup. I mean, for example, if you're Oracle, you're not going to necessarily sort of like go into a company and sort of like crowdsource. You know, you're going to be part of that process. You'll be part of a different type of approach. But you know, if you're a bank and you say, okay, well, we have this problem, you get a bunch of guys together, early stage companies. It could be just independents or small companies, and they'll build you stuff. And then through that process, you're actually sort of more efficient at solving the problem. But yeah, so I think like there's not necessarily like a sustainable coexistence between startups and Goliaths, because startups are so dynamic in its sense, right?
It's a very interesting point, Ravi. No. Well, this pretty much concludes most of the formal proceedings of the panel today. I'm quite keen to see if there are any questions from the floor. Oh, we have one. Okay, I'm going to hand the mic. Woohoo! Just introduce yourself if you may.
So my name is Shirley. I'm quite curious about the topic because it says David and Goliath, which is a combat, which is a competition, right? But while most of the time the panelists were talking about collaboration, how you can work together, it's more like matchmaking. So my question to the panelists is that, so when you select either corporate or startup, I think the lady has mentioned about some key metrics, revenues and IP, complementary, right? But to make it worthwhile to pursue, because once you decide that this is the startup, this is the corporate, I need to pursue and work together to make it, better for both. What are the key considerations? That's my question one. The second one is, what is roughly the life cycle going to look like?
So more of a competitive question and also the life cycle. Does anyone want to have a crack at that?
Yeah, so what are the considerations for the corporate or for the startup? Sure, I can speak on both as well. I think from the perspective of a startup, from corporate, if we're evaluating solutions in the market, obviously credibility, the basics, right? How long have these guys been around? What do they do? Does the solution fit our needs? And basically their profile as well. The other way around, essentially, if you're a startup, you're not that fussy, essentially, especially if you're starting out, right? If you get one client or get, any client who's willing to work with you, like, yes, you're perfect for me, no matter who you are or what you do, right? So it really depends who you're talking about. I think, obviously, corporates, they want partners who they can rely on, not just today, but tomorrow as well. So you don't want to work with a startup that, like you were saying, is going to run out of funds in a couple of months, right? Or startups who don't have sufficient controls internally to safeguard the corporate's data, for example, right? But yeah, so it really depends.
I think if I can add to that as well, I think certainly when I work with startups, I need them to be coachable. I need them to be presentable to a potential client. If I'm going to open up my Rolodex of potential contacts, I want to make sure that my reputation and brand aren't going to be impeded by that. So I think from that perspective, you've got to have a level of polish, a little bit of finesse, and also some, you've got to be able to back it up. I think there's a lot of startup hubris out there, and to be honest, as a corporate, I go in there with a bit of skepticism. Show me exactly what you've got. I really want to lift that hood and I want to see what's there. I don't want just fancy prototypes. I want something that's got some real coding. So I think being able to be prepared to actually open yourself up and actually show that. And I know that, I'm not sure potentially you may have also been asking, and I might be putting words in your mouth here, potentially around the sort of the IP risk and maybe potentially exposing yourself to a corporate that may be perceived to be taking that away from you. But I think ultimately, I think the way we work certainly with our startups is we certainly don't want to go in that spirit. You know, we want to make sure that we put all the relevant, agreements in place, but at the same time we do want to go in there with a spirit of collaboration. I think for us certainly it's about about an equal footing. I don't know if the rest of the panel might want to respond to that.
You actually make a very, very good point. I mean, so far we've talked a lot about how do we work together, but in actual fact, the title of this is David versus Goliath, which is competition. So I think something like a Facebook disrupting telecommunication industry, those were the Davids those were the Goliaths of the old times, right? And then Facebook comes along and says, hey, guess what? People want to communicate differently. They want to send pictures. They want to send messages. They want to do all these other things beyond just voice calls. And they're now a sort of a $500 billion company, and they've proven themselves. So I think in the context of that point, and maybe focusing more on the title, I think where the Davids can be successful is in taking advantages on new innovations in terms of new technologies. And I feel like the trend that we've seen in the last 10 years has been sort of the internet economy that's really thrived on globally, and in particular the smartphone economy as well. And the companies that have really capitalized on that have now sort of taken a leapfrog in terms of replacing traditional industries. And I think that's a good example of a successful David. Grab 7 years ago was 10 guys in a room in Malaysia, and now it's raised $10 billion plus minus, and it's kind of now competing strongly with his traditional taxi companies, food restaurants, financial services, and I guess one day Grab will grow to be a Goliath. Maybe someone will then displace them, but I think good point.
Yeah, and I think the genesis of corporate innovation, why do people care about innovation? It seems to have become a buzzword, right? I think it stems from that acknowledgement that there were a lot of traditional industries or companies who were losing out that battle because they were not keeping up with the trends of digital technology, digital transformation, and that has driven a lot of the awareness. And hence, there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction right now that, maybe we should be looking at what we could be doing differently, right? And which is where some of this, discussion started. So that definitely does exist, as far as I'm concerned.
Sorry, 1 second. I just want to talk a little bit about the title. Obviously, since I came up with it. So, traditionally, David, I think, if I'm not wrong, basically set out to get rid of Goliath, right?
That's right.
Now, if you translate that metaphor into today and what we're talking about, there are some startups out there who are effectively out there to kill the Goliaths,
yes,
right?
They're the new incumbents.
So if you look at TransferWise, for example, in the remittance business, the corporates, the banks refuse, I think, to partner with these guys, obviously because they're threatened by their existence. So in case you guys haven't realized, the title is Reimagining David and Goliath. So, so we're trying to, we're curious about asking, does it always have to be an antagonistic or adversarial relationship? Can they in fact be friends, like a little giant and a small little tiny guy, right? So that's the whole point of the conversation. That's why we're geared towards, the conversation is geared towards collaboration, because on both sides of the equation, startups and corporates, they are incentivized to work together because mutual benefits can be derived, right? And it doesn't always have to be antagonistic. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for doing my job, Hardesh. I think you should be moderating next time around. But no, absolutely. I think we are trying to create a new future. I think, let's face it, most of us realise that we have to do that. Any other questions out there? Oh, okay. We've got a mic runner up the back. Go ahead, gentleman at the back. Go for it.
Hi, my name is Talib. We've painted a very rosy picture till now. I wanted to ask, when does the corporate and startup sort of relationship does not work?
Does not work. So, like I said, having misalignment of expectations is a big thing. If you think you're going to go in there and convince a corporate to buy your product within a 2-month cycle, I think that's expectation misalignment sometimes, right? So that's why I keep talking about setting expectations up front. When does it not work? If you are at a point where you're having a conversation with a startup, there must be a reason why they're talking to you, right? So there is a need in there. But sometimes maybe it's not a match in culture, right? That sometimes is important if you're going to get to work together in a more intimate fashion, depending on how they're going to use it. If they're going to buy your services and just use you as a tool, maybe that's less important. If it's a investment type scenario, if it's a acquisition type scenario, big thing is not just the tech, it's also about the company, the culture, all of that side of things as well. And the second thing sometimes when it doesn't work well is, again, like I said, there are many internal stakeholders to convince, and you're just not in the right place at the right time, in the right cycle for that particular decision-making process, right? Yeah, again, it's situational. It depends. It varies from company to company. And you're right. We've painted a very rosy picture. My job is not not that easy. That I turn up every day, have 10 conversations, and sign 4 POCs every week, right? That's not how it works. We do spend a lot of time, creating processes and express lanes, as Hardesh was talking about, or exception processes to enable people to work with us. We've in the past had POCs which has taken us 9 months, 12 months, right? And we recognize that's not a way to work, either for the startup, because that's not the pace at which they want to work, neither is it something that is working for us, because the need was 9 months ago, right? So we need to move at the pace much quicker. So we have to do a lot of work internally ourselves to enable that, right? So we have a goal now where we want to go from initial discussion to POC in 3 months. And that's a big target for us, right? And to work with procurement, to work with legal, all of these aspects is a tough job, because like Ravi was saying, their job is to protect risk. Their job is to protect reputation, all of that sort of stuff, right? So yeah, it's not rosy at all.
Absolutely, I echo that 100%. Any other? Oh,
sorry,
did you want to add?
there are scary stories, Salim. So if you're a startup, you don't have a lot of resources to, keep servicing a client for 6 months, and then they tell you at the end of it, like we decided that internally we can't make this work. You would have wasted a lot of people's time, man hours, just trying to service this one client. There are situations where you will never find this out until it's too late, where there are large corporates who are effectively threatened by your existence because of what you're trying to do. So they may even act under the guise of wanting to collaborate with you, literally get into an exclusive relationship with you just to keep you out of the market. There have been scary stories like that as well. And unfortunately, being a startup, you tend to find this out too late, because you're always naive, you're always eager for a partnership, you're always eager for a deal, and this could come back and bite you in the bum, right? So, so there are more scary stories than, we're trying to be optimistic here, reimagining reality.
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Neha. My question is not so much about collaboration or the fight. My question is really about, because of how the startup ecosystem is now changing, and there are so many, for lack of better word, there's a lot of help around, right? There are so many accelerators. There are so many people trying to coach startup founders. Does it increase the confidence of corporates in startups? So is it helping them in their customer acquisition, do you think? So is the backing of, for example, if a startup is backed by EY, for example, it's obviously helping them with customer acquisition. Have you seen that a lot with your work?
Yeah, no, most definitely. And I think to your point as well, when I am looking for startups, knowing that they've come through something like an Entrepreneur First or an Antler, that gives me a little bit of credibility that they've actually had some support around them. And I know that, part of the reasons why a lot of startups want to work with us is because they want the brand. They want to be able to say, hang on, we've been selected by EY, we've gone through their InfoSec process, we know what it's like, we're enterprise ready. So we know that they do want to trade on our reputation.
But do you think that stifles the innovation sometimes?
Look, yes and no. I think in some ways we give them a credibility and legitimacy that they're craving for. And look, I think to Hardesh's point, yes, sometimes when you are going through a process of being enterprise ready, you are devoting a lot of man hours to it, and that probably prevents you from doing all those cool product enhancements that you want to do. But that's the reality, right? If you want to play with the big boys, then you've got to compromise somewhere.
Okay. All right.
I think we had a question actually up the front from Azure.
Hi everyone. My name is Azure. So my question is of three parts. So what are some of the examples of startups that had the most impact, which I've worked with? So are you still working with them today? And wait, what's the last part? Okay, and where do you found them? Yeah, thanks.
Where did you find them? So I think there are a few where we've signed up partnership agreements and they then became embedded in our product, or we jointly go to market with them, and they're still around, right? Which is why going back to the metrics around, are we booking revenue because of the additional technology that this particular startup brought us? That sort of tracking came from that question ourselves, right? Are we spotting these good opportunities, and are we making the most of those opportunities that we've onboarded? We've also had examples where we've invested in a startup, and then they become integral to the product, and then we ended up acquiring them as well, right? So yeah, there are examples of things that have just not been a POC, but actually gone to a commercial contract and then actually scaled from there as well. What was the second question? Where did you find them? So most of our startup scouting has been around, so we've consciously stayed away from setting up a fund and having people come to us and pitch and things like that. We've taken a different approach. We've actually tried to identify what are our internal business needs, and we've actually gone and talked to various business units and said that, look, we are not trying to change the entire way you work, right? But you must have key burning issues that you haven't either been able to solve internally, or you don't have the time or capacity to do that, right? And then we go and take those problem statements and see if we can find startups. And typically they would come through friendly VCs, through our network. You would have industry trade bodies, you would have various country-based bodies who are trying to promote their ecosystem. So like the Israeli ecosystem is being promoted by their trade mission, for example. So they would then have an understanding of our business model, of our needs, and will send through, oh, have you seen this cool cybersecurity company? And they do X, Y, and Z, right? That's how we've been sourcing our leads so far.
I mean, if I think about it backwards, I mean, the discovery problem, I think, is probably not the biggest problem. I think in today's world with the internet, digital channels, intelligent targeting, that there's really no problem. The question is, how do you filter? I think that's kind of the biggest problem right now. I mean, if I think about now on the kind of the corporate side, we get a lot of inbound inquiries, people trying to sell us all sorts of things. And the question is, how do we filter that? How do we put that through a funnel so that we can evaluate things and detect the things that will move the needle for us and then move ahead with that one? Which puts the burden then on the company, the startup, then to sort of like maintain full relevancy and to kind of solve that specific problem. The problem we face right now is because there are too many channels, you just get a lot of stuff that are just not relevant, and that is a challenge for us, and I think that's a broader problem in life right now. If we then think about it in terms of like, it's almost like a double-edged sword. The easier it is to work with startups, there is a double-edged sword with that one, because the easier it is to work with a startup, the easier it is to replace them as well. And I feel like what we're seeing a lot now is that companies that are easily able to sort of, sign up with a large company, they can also replace them very quickly as well because there's so much competition. In some circumstances, it takes 6 months to get into a company and they've never done it before. Once you're in with them, they can't afford to replace you, so they'll stick with you. So I think there's that dynamic. The other dynamic as well is that, as startups grow, there's always an inherent conflict of interest, right? Because the corporate always wants exclusivity, right? Because why would you want a company that's building your solution to then sell that solution to someone else and compromise your intellectual property, to steal your knowledge rights? They know exactly what's going on, and that's a huge risk. So you probably, startups and the Davids and Goliaths will always have that sort of like, we want exclusivity. No, we're going to pay for it. No, and so that is a real challenge. That is which I've and probably you've now been on the experience as well. I don't know what the answer to that actually, because of course as a startup you don't want to have exclusivity because you want to take one thing and expand across multiple clients. So I guess it's down to the negotiation.
Yeah.
How do you defend what you do and maintain integrity with your client and also be able to do that with others?
Well, I just generally say sharing is caring. The more
does that work?
We'll find out. No one said no yet. But the point is, like, look, increasingly most of the solutions out there, for example, are relying on at least offering benefits that can be derived from data network effects, right? So you share your data with me, I guarantee that we won't compromise your reputation or your business in any way. And in return, by you sharing information, you derive much more benefit from our platform, and everyone's a winner, right? So it is a journey. There are obviously concerns that they have, but we just try and sell a rosy picture essentially, and make everyone happy, right?
We have time for one more question. Any final takers? Okay, we've got a gentleman up here at the front. Do you want to quickly run a mic, or I'll do it?
Hello, I'm Niels from Kudenagel, 80,000 employees. I'm responsible for innovation. My question is more to you. The most boring question that I get from the business units all the times when I introduce a new concept, new idea, or a new startup, what's the business case? So, and usually there just isn't a business case yet because you have to find out, you have to experiment. So how do you get around this silly question in my mind?
Sorry. Okay. The business case question, interestingly, doesn't come up as much for us because we're not looking at it from an investment point of view in a majority of the cases. We do have investments, or we do make investments, and when it is an investment type discussion, then absolutely. Business cases, and defending your assumptions, and 2 years on, reviewing those business cases, and how did you get these assumptions wrong, and all of this sort of stuff, right? And that's part of growing up, right, as a corporate, to going from a very steady business model. Companies were created to be able to do something well in a repetitive manner, right? So you fine-tuned your processes, you fine-tuned your product, so you have a predictable output, right? That's how we build our market sizing and business cases and all of this sort of stuff, right? When you're dealing with new technology, trying to go into new markets, there's always going to be unknowns, right? And being comfortable with that risk factor, I think most companies do that because that's how they build their market entry strategies and things like that. But yeah, there's a big discussion around valuation, big discussion around business case. But for the partnership side of things, or working together, or jointly doing some sort of white labeling or whatever, there it's more about the actual value that the technology or the startup is able to provide. So the discussion around business case is less relevant in that context, or at least doesn't come up that much.
I would say if your business guys are asking you, like, what's the business case of these startups, then it's a reflection of the point I was making earlier, right? So what's the culture internally? Ideally, you would have compiled all the potential use cases and problems and holes that need to be plugged, and then use that information to go out there and source and curate startups. Then you have a much more meaningful dialogue, as opposed to you now becoming sort of a filtering mechanism for all these startups that are just coming through the door and trying to find some kind of fit. So you know what I mean? Like it's almost like you're going about it the wrong way. And again, that's a reflection on the point I was trying to make: culture. Who's driving this message, right? What are your use cases?
I think also just to add to that as well, I think like once you go through the few sales cycles, you sort of kind of spot the duds. You know, like there's a lot of corporates out there that will just bring you in and say, come in, you know, showcase your product, let's have a partnership deal. You'll have one meeting, you'll have two meetings, you'll present to 20, 30 people, and then, you know, nothing really happens. And that's a real big waste of time, because, you know, if you're a small company, you've got to really prepare for these things, and, you know, after a while, you sort of realize, actually, there's something going on here, right? You guys are kind of wasting our time, and, you know, so I think as an entrepreneur, as a startup, you've got to be really, really sort of clear about, like, you know, who is that right type of client? What are you selling to them? And sort of spotting out the things, like, you know, if someone asks you, like, what is the business case? It's like, I would sort of be worried about that a little bit, you know, if you put it onto the company, because like I'd be like, well, surely you know what you want. We can come in and execute that, right? So we don't have to sell to you the business case. You know your business case. We're here to sort of execute that. And our specialism is we know how to do it quicker and better and smarter than you.
So I guess the only point there would be the difference between the use case and the business case, right? The use case is something that you as a business unit should be aware of. The business case is more around, does this commercial, does this investment make sense, right? Like from a financial ROI point of view. So use case, absolutely, I agree that you have to have your problem statements, your needs defined, and then it makes the filtration process easier. But from the financials, again, it's the business case of what, right? Are you investing in that startup? Then sure. But is it a question of, does it make me money to offer this product at this price? You know, that's again, a more easy question to answer.
Probably from my perspective, mate, I think you just need to have your own budget, to be honest. I think if you've got a seat at the table, you know, if you've got someone that's in your corporate innovation team that is part of your, you know, your operating committee for decision making, that's on the C-suite, life is easy. So I think if you've got a strong internal champion that can carve out some budgets and play money for you to, therefore you don't need to run through those business cases. So I think if you've got credibility within the organisation, I often find doing stuff through stealth is actually really easy as well. So if I can go a bit under the radar, where I don't need to go and pitch for money to get a business case over the line, then I can actually show very early, I did this for 30K, or I've done this through, you know, a couple of favours, then that then helps get some traction. But I think we are at the end. We're actually now at sort of 5:30. We've got 30 minutes for you to go and network, so please make sure you say, you know, hi, g'day to someone that's sitting next to you. I'd love you to be able to join me in thanking the panellists that have joined me today. I've got Hardesh and Ravi and Priyanka. We hope you've taken something away. You've learnt something. I mean, I know that we are trying to reimagine, you know, what a new future would look like between corporates and startups. So we hope that you've taken away with something that you can take back to your jobs. So thank you very much for your time, and join me in thanking the panel.